There is a house on Cedar Street in Durham, North Carolina. A large stone mansion set back from the road, with ivy climbing the walls and tall windows that catch the evening light. If you drove past it on a December afternoon in 2001, you would not have noticed anything strange. Christmas decorations in the front window, a wreath on the door, 2 cars in the driveway, an ordinary American home belonging to an ordinary American family. But inside that house, in the back, there is a staircase, a narrow wooden staircase that curves down from the 2nd floor into a small landing by the kitchen. And on the night of December 9th, 2001, at approximately 2:40 in the morning, a woman's body was found at the bottom of those stairs. Her name was Kathleen Peterson. She was 48 years old, and she had 7 deep lacerations on the back of her head. I am Miles Ghost Hunter, and tonight we are going to walk down that staircase together. But before we do, I need to tell you something that took investigators almost a year to discover. Something that turned a tragic accident into one of the strangest murder cases in American history. Something that sent people all over this country into fierce, bitter arguments that continue to this day, more than 2 decades later. 16 years before Kathleen Peterson died at the bottom of a staircase in Durham, North Carolina, another woman died at the bottom of another staircase. A woman named Elizabeth Ratliff. She was 34 years old. She had 2 small daughters. She lived in a little town called Grafenhausen in West Germany, and she was found by her nanny on a November morning in 1985, lying in a pool of blood at the base of her stairs, her body still warm, her daughters asleep upstairs. The man who had been with Elizabeth Ratliff the night before she died, the man who walked her home that evening, the last person to see her alive. His name was Michael Peterson. 2 women, 2 staircases, 16 years apart. The same man first on the scene for both of them. Now, in 1985, nobody suspected anything. Elizabeth Ratliff had suffered from a bleeding condition. The German authorities called it a tragic accident. She was buried in Texas, next to her late husband, an Air Force officer who had died less than a year before her in a plane crash. Her 2 orphaned daughters, Margaret and Martha, ages 2 and 4, were taken in by their mother's best friends, a couple named Michael and Patricia Peterson. They raised those little girls as their own. 16 years later, in December of 2001, Michael Peterson was no longer married to Patricia. He had remarried. His new wife was Kathleen Hunt Atwater, a telecommunications executive, a brilliant woman. The first female graduate of Duke University's engineering program in her class. A woman who worked late, laughed loudly, and had finally, after a difficult first marriage and years of raising her daughter Caitlin alone, found what she believed was real happiness with Michael Peterson. And now she was dead at the bottom of a staircase, just like Elizabeth Ratliff. To understand how we got from that first staircase in Germany to the 2nd staircase in North Carolina, to understand the 5 children whose lives were torn apart, the jury that convicted, the evidence that crumbled, the freedom that followed, and the strange plea that ended it all, we have to start with Kathleen. Because every true crime story begins not with the killer, but with the person who was loved. Kathleen Hunt was born on February 21st, 1953, in Rhode Island. She was the oldest of 3 daughters. Her sister Candace would later become the loudest voice demanding justice for her. Her sister Laurie would stand on the opposite side of the courtroom, believing her sister's husband was innocent. But in 1953, none of that existed yet. There was only a little girl with bright eyes and a sharp mind, growing up in a working-class family, the kind of family where you were expected to earn everything you got. Kathleen earned everything. She was the first woman admitted to Duke University's engineering school. She graduated in 1975. She went to work at Nortel Networks, a Canadian telecommunications giant, and over 2 decades she climbed. senior director, vice president level. By the time she met Michael Peterson in the mid-1990s, she was making more than $145,000 a year and managing teams of engineers across multiple states. In an industry still dominated by men, she was a quiet but undeniable force. She had been married before. Her first husband was named Fred Atwater. They had one daughter together, Caitlin. That marriage ended in divorce in the late 1980s, and Kathleen raised Caitlin largely on her own, balancing corporate travel with pickup lines and soccer games. Friends remembered her walking into parent-teacher conferences in full business suits, still holding a briefcase, apologizing for being late, and then asking detailed questions about her daughter's homework. She was, by every account, an exhausted, devoted, absolutely present mother. She met Michael Peterson in 1989 through mutual friends. He was a published novelist, a former Marine, a charismatic man who had traveled the world, who wrote op-eds for the local newspaper, who ran for mayor of Durham in 1999 and lost, who ran for city council and lost, but who always seemed to be at the center of conversations. He was funny. He was well-read. He talked about politics and literature and the war in Vietnam with equal passion. Kathleen, who had spent her life surrounded by engineers and spreadsheets, found him fascinating. They married in 1997. By then, Michael was already raising 4 children. His 2 biological sons, Clayton and Todd, from his first marriage to Patricia, and the 2 Ratliff daughters, Margaret and Martha, whom he and Patricia had adopted after their mother's death in Germany. When Kathleen moved in and Caitlin came with her, the household grew to 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys. A blended family that by most accounts genuinely worked. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations, stepchildren who called Kathleen Mom without hesitation. The mansion on Cedar Street was purchased in 1992, a 5,000-square-foot colonial with a swimming pool in the backyard, hardwood floors, custom woodwork, an expensive home that, on Michael Peterson's writer's income alone, would have been impossible to sustain. But Kathleen was the breadwinner. Her salary, her bonuses, her stock options. Kathleen paid for that house. Kathleen paid for the children's college tuition. Kathleen paid for the trips to Europe, the dinners out, the life that allowed Michael to wake up every morning and write. On December 7, 2001, Kathleen Peterson was 48 years old. She was 2 weeks away from Christmas. Her sisters were planning to visit. Caitlin was home from college. The house was decorated with lights and garlands. There was a tree in the living room with wrapped presents beneath it. Kathleen had told her sister Candace on the phone that she was looking forward to the holidays, that she was going to take time off work, that she was happy. 2 days later, she was dead. It is 2:39 in the morning on December 9th, 2001. The Durham County emergency dispatcher receives a call. The voice on the other end is frantic, shouting, breathing hard. It is Michael Peterson. He is inside the mansion on Cedar Street. He tells the dispatcher that his wife has fallen down the stairs, that she is still breathing, that she has hit her head. He begs them to send an ambulance. The dispatcher tries to calm him, to get him to stay on the line, to give her the address. He is barely coherent. He drops the phone. There are long seconds of silence on the recording. Then he picks up again, still gasping. The call lasts less than 2 minutes. By the time paramedics arrive at the house at 2:47 a.m., it has been 8 minutes since Michael placed the call. The front door is unlocked. Michael is standing in the foyer, wearing a blue button-down shirt, khaki shorts, and flip-flops. His clothing is stained with blood. His face is streaked with it. He leads them through the kitchen, around a corner, and points at the base of the back staircase. Kathleen Peterson is lying on her side on the hardwood landing at the bottom of the stairs. Her legs are partially on the second step. Her arms are splayed. Her auburn hair is matted. And all around her, on the wooden floor, on the walls, on the baseboards, up the stairs themselves, is blood. A lot of blood. The paramedics check her pulse. She has none. They check her pupils. They are fixed. Her body is cooling. She has been dead for some time. Longer, perhaps, than a sudden fall could explain. The lead paramedic steps back and looks at the scene. He has been doing this job for many years. He has seen falls downstairs. This does not look like any of them. The amount of blood is wrong. The pattern of the blood is wrong. The position of the body is wrong. And Michael Peterson, standing behind him, is asking over and over if she is going to be all right. She is not going to be all right. Kathleen Peterson is already gone. Within an hour, Durham police are at the scene. Detective Art Holland ambles, hits their head once, perhaps twice. The blood, if there is blood, is localized. It pools beneath the head. It does not spray. What Detective Holland sees at the bottom of the Peterson staircase is spray. He sees cast-off blood on the walls, at heights that would be impossible from a simple fall. He sees blood pooled in multiple distinct locations. He sees bloody footprints leading away from the body and returning. He sees drag marks. And on Kathleen Peterson's scalp, when the medical examiner arrives and gently parts her hair, he counts 7 deep lacerations. 7. Not 1, not 2. 7 separate wounds on the back of her skull, each of them deep enough to expose tissue, each of them with what appeared to be a specific shape, long, narrow, almost parallel, as though something thin and hard had struck her repeatedly. And yet, despite these 7 deep lacerations, despite the sheer volume of blood in that stairwell, when the medical examiner later performed the autopsy, she would find something even stranger. Kathleen Peterson's skull was not fractured. No bones in her neck were broken. No significant internal injuries anywhere in her body. A fall down a staircase that produces 7 head lacerations should produce a skull fracture. A beating with a blunt object that produces 7 head lacerations should produce a skull fracture. The absence of a fracture was a puzzle that investigators would wrestle with for months. But the presence of those 7 wounds, and the pattern of the blood, and the behavior of the man who had called them, made one thing immediately clear to Detective Holland. This was not an accident. Michael Peterson, meanwhile, sat in his living room answering questions. He told the officers that he and Kathleen had spent the evening by the pool in the backyard, that they had opened a bottle of wine, that they had watched a movie together, a film called America's Sweethearts, that around 2 in the morning, Kathleen said she was going up to bed, that he stayed outside by the pool a little longer, finishing his drink, enjoying the cool December night, that when he eventually came inside, he found her. He estimated he had been outside for 30 to 45 minutes after she went in. He had not heard anything, no scream, no thud, nothing. He had come in, walked through the house, and found her at the bottom of the back staircase. The officers noted his demeanor. He was distraught. He was crying. But he was also, at moments, strangely composed. He asked for a glass of water. He asked if he could change his bloody clothing. He asked about his son, who was away at college. Within 90 minutes of finding his wife dead, Michael Peterson was discussing practical matters. Detective Holland asked him if he would consent to a search of the house. Michael said yes, immediately. Over the following hours, as the sun rose over Durham on December 9th, 2001, forensic investigators walked every inch of the Peterson mansion. They photographed the staircase from every angle. They swabbed blood samples from walls, from floors, from Kathleen's body, from Michael's shorts. They bagged his clothing as evidence. They took his shoes. They collected fibers. They dusted for fingerprints. And in the basement of the house, mounted on a wrought iron rack by the fireplace, they found something missing. A fireplace tool set. 4 tools on the rack. Shovel, brush, tongs, and a 4th hook where a blowpoke should have hung. A blowpoke is a long, narrow, hollow brass or iron tube used to blow air onto a fire to make it burn hotter. It is also, investigators noted grimly, almost exactly the right shape and weight to produce parallel, narrow lacerations on the back of a human skull. The blowpoke was gone. Michael Peterson, when asked about it, said he did not know where it was. He said they had not used the fireplace often. He said it might have been thrown out years ago. Kathleen's sister Candace, when later asked, said she remembered the blowpoke. She said she had seen it in that rack, on visits to the house, within the past year. The weapon, if it existed, was never found. But the absence of the weapon did not stop the investigation, because as forensic teams worked the scene, detectives began the other part of every murder investigation. They began looking into the life of Michael Peterson, and within days, a second portrait began to emerge. A portrait very different from the grieving husband weeping on his couch. Michael Ivor Peterson was born on October 23, 1943, in Nashville, Tennessee. He was the son of a career Army officer, and he grew up on military bases across America and Europe. He was intelligent, driven, popular. He attended Duke University, graduating in 1965. Then he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps and went to Vietnam. What happened in Vietnam would become a central question of his life. For decades, Michael Peterson told the story that he had served in combat, had been wounded, had received a Purple Heart and a Silver Star. He wrote novels about Vietnam. He wrote op-eds about Vietnam in the Durham Herald-Sun, often criticizing local politicians for their lack of military service. When he ran for mayor in 1999 and for city council in 2001, his military record was part of his campaign identity. In 2002, after his arrest for Kathleen's murder, reporters began checking, and what they found was a different story. Michael Peterson had served in the Marines. That much was true. He had been stationed in Japan, but the wounds he claimed came from combat in Vietnam had actually come from a car accident in Japan. The Silver Star had never been awarded. The Purple Heart had never been earned. The Vietnam combat experience he had written about and spoken about for 30 years was fabricated. He had lied, for decades, about something fundamental to his public identity. And this mattered now, not because of politics, but because of what it revealed about him. Michael Peterson was a man who could construct elaborate false versions of himself and live inside them convincingly. He was a novelist. He understood narrative. He understood how to make people believe things that were not true. And the investigators looking into Kathleen's death found something else. On Michael Peterson's home computer, a forensic analyst discovered a secret life: emails, photographs, credit card records. Michael had been communicating with male escorts. He had scheduled meetings. He had discussed specific services and specific prices. One email, sent to a Marine escort named Brad, described in detail what Michael wanted and what he was willing to pay. The email was dated September 21st, 2001, 3 months before Kathleen died. Prosecutors would later argue that Kathleen had discovered these emails on the night of December 8th, sitting at the computer in her home office while Michael was outside by the pool. That she had confronted him, that a fight had erupted, that the fight had ended at the bottom of the staircase. The defense would argue the opposite, that Kathleen had known about Michael's bisexuality for years, that it was not a secret in their marriage, that there was no fight, that it was an accident. But there was another piece of information that shifted the scales. Kathleen Peterson's life was insured. $1.4 million in life insurance, with Michael as the sole primary beneficiary. And the Peterson household, despite Kathleen's substantial income, was deeply in financial trouble. Credit card debt, mortgage pressure, children in expensive private universities, a lifestyle that the salary coming in could no longer sustain. When Kathleen died, Michael Peterson stood to collect $1.4 million, and investigators noted, quietly, that Kathleen had made an appointment with her financial advisor for the following week. She had told her sister Candace on the phone, 2 days before her death, that she needed to rethink some things. So now, In the spring of 2002, the investigation had two things: a physical scene that did not match a fall, and a husband who had lied about his military service, had a secret life, was in severe financial distress, and stood to inherit more than $1 million from his wife's death. It was enough for a grand jury. On December 20th, 2001, just 11 days after Kathleen's body was found, Michael Peterson was indicted for first-degree murder. But the case was still, in many ways, circumstantial. There was no confession. There was no eyewitness. There was no weapon. The prosecution had a story, but they needed to prove it. And as they prepared for trial, the lead prosecutor, an assistant district attorney named Frida Black, and her colleague Jim Hardin began pulling at every thread of Michael Peterson's life. Every email, every financial record, every past acquaintance. And that is when they found Germany. Elizabeth Ratliff was a name already known to the Peterson children. Margaret and Martha grew up knowing that their biological mother had died in an accident in Germany in 1985, when they were very small. They grew up knowing that their adoptive parents, Michael and Patricia Peterson, had been Elizabeth's closest friends. They grew up knowing, in the vague way children know things, that their mother had fallen down a staircase. What they did not know, and what almost no one in Durham knew, was the specific details of that death. November 25th, 1985. Grafenhausen, West Germany. Elizabeth Ratliff, 34 years old, widow of an Air Force officer killed in a plane crash 20 months earlier, was a teacher at the Rhine-Main base school. She lived in a rented house with her two daughters, Margaret, aged 3, and Martha, aged 2. She had a nanny, a young German woman named Barbara O'Hara, who came most days to help with the children. On the evening of November 24th, Elizabeth attended a dinner party at the home of her closest friends, Michael and Patricia Peterson. Michael Peterson, at that time, was living in Grafenhausen while working as a writer and journalist, having left the Marines years earlier. His wife Patricia was also a teacher at the base school. The Petersons and Elizabeth Ratliff were inseparable, best friends, a surrogate family since the death of Elizabeth's husband. After dinner, Elizabeth was tired. Michael offered to walk her home. They left the Peterson house together, walked the short distance through the quiet German neighborhood, and Michael helped Elizabeth carry her sleeping youngest daughter inside and upstairs to bed. Then, according to Michael's account, he said goodnight to Elizabeth at her front door. He walked home alone. He went to bed beside his wife. The next morning, November 25th, Barbara O'Hara, the nanny, arrived at Elizabeth's house shortly before 7 in the morning. The front door was unlocked. Barbara walked inside, and at the bottom of the narrow wooden staircase that led to the second floor of the house, she found Elizabeth Ratliff lying on her side in a pool of blood. Elizabeth was dead. She had been dead for several hours, judging by the cooling of her body. Her daughters, Margaret and Martha, were upstairs, asleep in their beds. Barbara did not scream. She did not touch the body. She walked to a neighbor's house and used their telephone to call the Petersons. Michael and Patricia Peterson arrived within minutes. Michael handled everything. He took control of the scene. He called the American military police, who had jurisdiction over American civilians on base-adjacent property. He comforted the children. He organized the cleanup. Within days, Elizabeth's body was shipped back to Texas for burial. The Peterson family, by prior arrangement in Elizabeth's will, became the legal guardians of Margaret and Martha Ratliff. The cause of death, as determined by a German pathologist working with American military authorities, was intracerebral hemorrhage, bleeding in the brain. Elizabeth had a known medical condition, von Willebrand disease, a blood disorder that impaired clotting. The official conclusion was that Elizabeth had suffered some kind of spontaneous cerebral bleed, collapsed at the top of the stairs, and fallen down. There was no autopsy in the modern American sense. There was no investigation into the scene. The case was closed within 96 hours. In 2002, investigators from the Durham District Attorney's Office, preparing for Michael Peterson's trial, obtained a copy of the original German medical report. They sent it to Dr. Aaron Gleckman, a forensic pathologist at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of North Carolina. Dr. Gleckman read the report. He looked at the photographs, and he told them what no one in 1985 had been willing to say. Elizabeth Ratliff had not died of a cerebral hemorrhage. She had lacerations on her scalp, multiple lacerations, the same kind of injuries in the same kind of location as Kathleen Peterson. In April of 2003, 4 months before Michael Peterson's trial was set to begin, the body of Elizabeth Ratliff was exhumed from her grave in Bay City, Texas. It had been buried for 17 years and 5 months. A full forensic autopsy was performed for the first time. Dr. Gleckman examined the skull. He counted 7 lacerations on the back of her head. 7. The exact same number of lacerations found on Kathleen Peterson's head 16 years later. Dr. Gleckman's conclusion was unambiguous. Elizabeth Ratliff had been beaten to death. Her death was reclassified as homicide. Her death certificate was amended, and the prosecution now had something almost unheard of in American criminal law. They had a defendant charged with murder, and they had another woman dead in strikingly similar circumstances, in a case where the defendant had been the last person to see her alive. This was the state of the evidence as Michael Peterson's trial began on July 1, 2003, in the Durham County Courthouse. A trial that would last 86 days, a trial that would be filmed in its entirety by a French documentary crew led by filmmaker Jean-Xavier de Lestrade, whose footage would eventually become the Peabody Award-winning series that introduced the world to the Peterson case and helped create the modern true crime documentary genre as we know it today. Michael Peterson sat at the defense table, flanked by his legal team, led by David Rudolph, one of the most respected criminal defense attorneys in North Carolina. Across the aisle, the prosecution team of Jim Hardin and Frida Black. And in the gallery, in 2 separate sections divided by the courtroom aisle, sat the Peterson family and the Hunt family. Michael's children on one side, Kathleen's sisters on the other. They did not speak to each other. They did not look at each other. A family destroyed, sitting 10 feet apart, watching. Based on what investigators had gathered, prosecutors told the jury a specific story about what had happened on the night of December 8, 2001. The state argued it went like this. Kathleen Peterson had come home from work around 7 in the evening. She and Michael had eaten dinner. They had opened a second bottle of wine. They had gone out to the pool area and talked. At some point, Kathleen went back inside, possibly to check her email for a work message she was expecting from France. The state argued that what Kathleen actually found in that email account, sitting at Michael's home office computer, was evidence of his communications with male escorts. Specific, graphic, undeniable evidence. The state argued that Kathleen confronted Michael, that an argument escalated, that sometime after midnight, in or near the back staircase, Michael struck Kathleen with a blunt object. Not once, 7 times. Hard enough to open deep lacerations in her scalp, but without the force or angle required to fracture her skull. Kathleen did not die immediately. She bled for some time, possibly attempting to rise, possibly pleading. The state argued that Michael waited, that he watched, that Kathleen eventually bled to death on the floor at the bottom of the stairs. Then, according to prosecutors, Michael Peterson did what a novelist would do. He constructed a narrative. He cleaned himself up, partially. He disposed of the weapon, possibly the missing blowpoke. Somewhere on the heavily wooded property, he waited for rigor mortis to begin to set in, which would explain the timing discrepancy between when Kathleen died and when Michael called for help. And then, at 2:39 in the morning, He picked up the phone and played the role of the grieving husband. The defense told a completely different story. David Rudolph argued that Kathleen had gone inside alone, that she had consumed too much wine, that she was taking Valium, that she had climbed the back staircase to go to bed, that she had slipped near the top, that she had fallen, that she had struck her head multiple times on the way down, on the trim of the staircase, on the step edges, on the wall, that the multiple lacerations were consistent with a fall, not with a weapon, that the lack of a skull fracture was actually evidence that supported the accidental explanation, and that Michael Peterson, coming in from the pool, had found his wife already dead or dying at the bottom of those stairs. As for Elizabeth Ratliff, the defense argued that her death 16 years earlier had been correctly classified at the time, that the exhumation and re-examination in 2003 was politically motivated, that there was no evidence linking Michael to her death beyond the fact that he had walked her home that night, that the similarity between the two deaths was, in a world where millions of falls happen every year, a tragic coincidence. The trial was a war. 86 days of expert witnesses, forensic testimony, blood spatter analysis, psychological evaluation, character witnesses, and family testimony. Kathleen's sister Candice Samperini delivered searing testimony against Michael. Michael's children, particularly Todd and Clayton, defended their father passionately. Margaret and Martha Ratliff, the two daughters of Elizabeth, sat in the courtroom watching their adoptive father be accused of murdering their biological mother. They did not believe the prosecution. They stood by Michael. The most important witness for the state was a man named Dwayne Deaver. Dwayne Deaver was a blood spatter analyst working for the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. He had been doing blood spatter analysis for 16 years. He came to the stand with confidence, with diagrams, with models, with a demonstration video. Over 2 days of testimony, Deaver walked the jury through the blood evidence at the Peterson staircase. He described spatter patterns that, in his expert opinion, could not have been produced by a fall. He described blood on the inside of Michael Peterson's shorts, droplets that, he argued, could only have gotten there if Michael was standing over Kathleen while she was being struck. He described cast-off patterns on the walls that matched the swinging motion of a weapon. Dwayne Deaver was, the jury would later say, the single most convincing witness in the entire trial. The prosecution's case rested, in significant part, on his testimony. On October 10, 2003, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Michael Ivor Peterson was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Kathleen Hunt Atwater Peterson. The sentence was automatic under North Carolina law, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Michael Peterson stood in the courtroom as the verdict was read. He did not cry. He did not speak. His children, Todd and Clayton, and his adopted daughters Margaret and Martha, sobbed in the gallery. Kathleen's sisters Candice and Lori held each other. Candice wept with relief. Lori, who had come to believe in Michael's innocence, wept with devastation. The family that had once shared Christmas dinners at the mansion on Cedar Street was now permanently split in half. Michael Peterson was led away in handcuffs. He was transported to Nash Correctional Institution in eastern North Carolina. He began serving a life sentence. And the story, as far as most Americans knew, was over. It was not over. What began to unravel, slowly, over the following years, was not the evidence of Michael Peterson's guilt. It was the credibility of the man whose testimony had convinced the jury. In 2010, 7 years after Peterson's conviction, the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation came under scrutiny. A series of investigative journalism reports, culminating in a state-commissioned audit, revealed systemic problems within the SBI's forensic lab. Analysts had, in case after case, overstated the certainty of their findings. They had withheld exculpatory results from defense attorneys. They had, in some cases, fabricated data. Duane Deaver's name appeared at the center of the audit. In a review of more than 200 cases involving Deaver's blood analysis work, investigators found that he had misrepresented evidence, withheld contradictory test results, or drawn conclusions unsupported by his data in dozens of instances. At least 3 men convicted of murder based on Deaver's testimony were released because their convictions were determined to be unsafe. Deaver was fired from the SBI in January of 2011. For Michael Peterson, the implications were enormous. If Deaver's testimony had been fraudulent, or at minimum, had violated basic standards of forensic science, then the blood spatter evidence that had been so central to the conviction could no longer be trusted. David Rudolph, still representing Michael, filed a motion for a new trial. On December 14, 2011, Judge Orlando Hudson, the same judge who had presided over the original trial, granted the motion. Michael Peterson's conviction was vacated. He had served 8 years and 2 months in prison. He was released on bond, pending a decision about whether the state would retry him. He walked out of prison and back into the world, an older, thinner, gray-haired man, no longer the confident defendant of 2003. His children embraced him on the courthouse steps. Kathleen's sister Candace stood nearby, watching in quiet anger, telling reporters that justice had just been undone. The state of North Carolina declined to drop the charges, but the years passed. Witnesses died, memories faded, evidence degraded. The prospect of a full retrial, with all of its costs and uncertainties and no guarantee of a second conviction, hung over both sides. Then, in February of 2017, 15 years after Kathleen's death and 6 years after Peterson's release, a final resolution arrived. It was not a verdict. It was something rarer and stranger, an Alford plea. An Alford plea is a legal device in American criminal law in which a defendant maintains their innocence while simultaneously acknowledging that the prosecution has enough evidence to likely convict them. The defendant accepts the conviction. They do not admit guilt. The court accepts the plea as if it were a guilty plea. Michael Peterson stood in court on February 24, 2017, and entered an Alford plea to a reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter. The judge sentenced him to 64 to 86 months in prison, a sentence already covered by the time he had served before his release. He walked out of that courtroom a free man. He did not go back to prison. He did not admit killing Kathleen. He was 73 years old. So here is the ending, or the closest thing to an ending that this case has ever produced. Every aberration that was noted in the first half of this story, the prosecution believed was explained by its reconstruction. The 7 lacerations without a skull fracture, because the weapon used was light and narrow. The high blood spatter, because the beating was savage and prolonged. The drag marks, because Michael moved the body. The bloody footprints, because Michael walked away and returned. The missing blow poke, because Michael disposed of it. The 2-hour gap between death and the 911 call, because Michael needed to think. The second staircase death, 16 years earlier, because this was how Michael Peterson killed, when he killed, with walls and stairs, and the ability to call it an accident afterward. The defense, and Michael Peterson himself, maintained throughout that none of it happened, that Kathleen fell, that Elizabeth fell, that he was a man cursed by 2 tragic coincidences, 16 years apart. And then there was the owl. In 2009, a neighbor and a local attorney advanced a theory that would become an international curiosity. They argued that a barred owl, native to the Forest Hills neighborhood of Durham, had attacked Kathleen as she stood on her driveway outside the house on the night of December 8th, that she had stumbled into the house, disoriented, and bleeding from scalp injuries caused by the owl's talons, that she had tried to climb the back staircase, that she had fallen, that the blood spatter, the lacerations, even a tiny cedar feather some claimed was found in her hair. All of it could be explained by an owl attack. The owl theory was not part of Michael Peterson's defense at trial, but in the years afterward it became a kind of folk legend of American true crime, a way to explain everything that did not make sense. A way to believe that Kathleen's death was not murder, not even a fall, but something stranger and sadder and more unknowable. The owl theory has been debated by forensic experts, birders, lawyers, and podcasters ever since. It has never been proven. It has never been disproven. It remains, for those who want it to, a door that never quite closes. What remained after the Alford plea was a family still divided. Kathleen's sisters, Candice and Laurie, stood on opposite sides of the question and never reconciled. Candice believed Michael killed Kathleen and had gotten away with it. Laurie believed Michael was innocent and had been wrongfully imprisoned for 8 years. Michael's adopted daughter, Margaret Ratliff, whose biological mother had died on a staircase in Germany when she was 3, remained his fiercest defender. Her sister Martha did the same. Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin Atwater, who had been home from college for that Christmas in 2001, filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Michael and won a default judgment of $25 million that she has never collected. She does not speak to her former step-siblings. Michael Peterson, in his late 70s, moved to a small home near Durham. He continued to write. In 2023, he self-published a memoir about his experience. He maintained his innocence in every interview he gave. He gave many interviews. The documentary series that began filming on the first day of his trial eventually became 13 episodes, reaching a global audience through streaming. Netflix acquired it in 2018. HBO produced a dramatized version starring Colin Firth in 2022. Michael Peterson became, improbably, one of the most discussed criminal defendants in modern American history. Kathleen Peterson would have turned 72 in February of 2025. She is buried at Maplewood Cemetery in Durham, less than 3 miles from the house where she died. Her daughter Caitlin visits the grave on her birthday every year, waves down from the 2nd floor to the small landing by the kitchen. The blood has been cleaned. New owners have lived there. Life has moved on, the way life always does after violence, imperfectly and without justice. But Kathleen Hunt Atwater is still dead. Elizabeth Ratliff is still dead. And the question of what happened to them on 2 different staircases, 16 years apart, is a question that America is still arguing about. I am Miles, Ghost Hunter. Thank you for walking down these stairs with me tonight. Next week, we move from the American South to the Hollywood Hills, where another spouse was found shot to death in a parked car outside a Studio City restaurant, and a famous actor named Robert Blake spent the rest of his life insisting he had only gone back inside for his gun. Until then, stay curious, stay careful, and lock your doors.